Welcome to the South Dakota Department of Revenue's presentation on spec builders and house flipping. The information provided in this video is current as of January 2024. Who is a spec builder? A spec builder is any person who makes a realty improvement and sells the property within 4 years, holds title to the land and builds with the intent to sell, or purchases a property, makes improvements to the property, and then sells the property. This is commonly referred to as flipping. Criteria of a spec builder. To be defined as a spec builder, an individual must meet the following requirements. First, the individual must have title to the land. Second, they must be building or remodeling an existing structure with the intention to sell. Lastly, the builder does not have to do any of the construction work. Tax responsibilities of a spec builder. Spec builders are required to have a contractor's excise tax license. An example of such a license is shown here on the screen. Spec builders are also required to issue prime contractors exemption certificates to subcontractors building the structure. Of note, the spec builder cannot issue a prime contractor's exemption certificate for land improvements. More information on the prime contractor's exemption certificates can be found on the exemption certificates tax facts under the publications section of the department's website. The spec builder is responsible for the contractor's excise tax when the property is sold if it is within 4 years of completion. More on this on the next slide. They are also responsible for paying sales tax on all purchases, otherwise use tax is due. Contractor's excise tax. A 2% contractor's excise tax is due when the realty improvement is sold. However, contractor's excise tax does not apply if the realty improvement sells more than 4 years after the completion date. For new builds, contractor's excise tax is due on the difference in the selling price and the cost of land improvements. For remodel/flip properties, contractor's excise tax is due on the selling price less the purchase price. Some additional information to keep in mind is that licensed contractors are spec builders, even if they build/remodel and sell one home. For example, drywall contractors. A realtor that owns land and builds or remodels the property to sell is also classified as a spec builder. If a property is purchased and resold without improvements, the profits are not subject to contractor's excise tax. The contractor's excise tax only applies if improvements are made to the property. Rental or use of a spec home. If a property has a fair market value or assessed value of greater than $100,000 and the property is rented, contractor's excise tax is due on the fair market value of the home, not including the value of the land. Rental or use of a spec home less than $100,000. If a contractor moves into a spec home or rents the house with a fair market value or assessed value of less than $100,000, they would owe contractor's excise tax on amounts paid to subcontractors that were issued prime contractors exemption certificates. For example, if a contractor built a spec home with a fair market value of $95,000 but issued prime contractors exemption certificates to subcontractors in the amount of $65,000, contractor's excise tax is due by the contractor on the $65,000 paid to the subs. Contractors building their own homes. If a contractor builds their own home, they cannot issue prime contractors exemption certificates to subcontractors. Additionally, if the property is sold within 4 years of completion, contractor's excise tax is due on the selling price less the cost of the land improvements, and amounts contractor's excise tax was already paid on at the time of the build. Examples. A contracting company rents a spec home that is valued at $150,000, not including the value of the land. The month that the house is rented out, the contracting company owes the contractor's excise tax on the $150,000, which would be $3,000 in tax. A year later, the same spec home is sold for $200,000. The contracting company would owe, at the time of the sale, contractor's excise tax on $25,000, which would be $500 in tax. The $25,000 is the sale price of the home, which was $200,000, minus the $150,000 that excise tax was already paid on, and minus the $25,000 land value. Examples continued. A contractor builds a spec home valued at $230,000. This home has been on the market for 8 months. The contractor issued prime contractors exemption certificates and paid a total of $130,000 to subcontractors. The contractor paid $25,000 for the lot when purchased. If the contractor moves in rather than leaving it vacant, at the time contractor's excise tax is due on the $130,000 that was paid to the subcontractors. If the home is sold a year later for $250,000, the contractor will owe contractor's excise tax on $95,000. This amount is the selling price of $250,000 less the $130,000 that contractor's excise tax was already paid on and less the $25,000 land cost. Criteria for the $100,000 rule. All four of the following criteria must be met for a property to qualify for the $100,000 rule. The property must be a new construction. An addition or expansion to an existing building does not constitute new construction. This must be the construction of a building that does not depend structurally upon an existing wall. The building must be valued at over $100,000. This is the structure value, not including land or land improvements. The building must be leased to others. If the property is sold and not leased, the $100,000 rule does not apply. The owner or employee of the owner must do a portion of the actual construction, or the owner must possess a contractor's excise tax license. Buildings to be moved/auction purchases. When remodeling existing homes to sell or flip, the original cost of the structure, including the land, can be deducted from the selling price. Purchasing a building on auction or a building that must be moved are both subject to sales or use tax. If purchasing a home in South Dakota to move out of the state, sales or use tax would still be owed. Common errors. The following are a few common errors that are encountered with spec homes. Not issuing prime contractors exemption certificates to subcontractors. Issuing prime contractors exemption certificates for sales taxable services such as engineering services, architectural services, construction management services, installing sales taxable flooring, landscaping services, etc. Not reporting the applicable use tax on materials and services if no sales tax was paid at the time of purchase. Reporting based on construction draws when the excise tax should be calculated based on the selling price less the value of the land and land improvements. Taking deductions that are not allowed, such as realtor fees, seller paid allowances, amounts paid to subcontractors, cost of materials, etc. And the 4-year period is based on how long ago construction was completed, not based on how long the spec builder owned title to the land.
If you have any additional questions, please contact the Department of Revenue at dor.sd.gov or by scanning the QR code on the screen.